right, 8 a.m. Week 10. Not many weeks left. Not many weeks left at all. So we have lab this week. We're going to analyze our data that we collected. Each lab instructor will have their own data. So your lab instructor will give you the summary data. And then, let's see here. Next week, we are in lab again. So both of these next 2 weeks, if you want to bring your laptop and work in Excel, you can. That's how I'm going to show it, how to do our analysis. I'm going to show you how to set it up in Excel, have it calculate our means and variances for us. And also we'll do some statistical tests. If you look at the blackboard for our lab, it has 2 statistical tables to print out, a t-table and a chi-square table. You can print them out, or you can just, if you have a tablet, you can download them, make sure you have them accessible, because we'll use them to obtain some critical values and compare our test statistic to those critical values to determine if our value, if the observed equals what we expect. And we'll talk about how to do that in lab. So, analyzing data. Our quiz, lecture quiz, is due tomorrow night. All right, and then the second quiz, we're going to finish this up, go over the summary of the demographic characteristics. That'll go live in about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. All right, I have that due date set for Thursday night. So normally, if it went live today, you'd have it would be due on Wednesday night. I'm going to give you till Thursday night, so that way you can kind of review the first part, 6.1, and then you'll have time to look through 6.2 on Tuesday and Wednesday, or Wednesday and Thursday morning before you take this. All right? Any questions? All right. So, characteristics of populations. We've got our population size, or density, right? We've got dispersion, so spatial patterns. And then we also have the demographic characteristics. And the demographic characteristics include age structure, birth schedules, and sex ratios. All right, so why bother? Well, if you're interested in populations, you have to be able to describe them in some way. In many cases, we look at populations and we're unsure if this group here and this group over there are actually interacting, if we could call them one big population, or are they separate populations? If we didn't want to go through and actually do all of the sequencing, because maybe it's expensive and we didn't have the resources to do that, one way in which we could go figure this out is to look at some of these characteristics. We could look at densities, we could look at dispersion patterns, we could then look at age structures or birth schedules or sex ratios. If those populations differ in some of these characteristics, then there's a good chance that these are 2 separate populations going down their own evolutionary path. All right, so we finish up with these demographic characteristics. Age structure is that distribution of individuals across the various ages. All right, and that could reveal patterns in mortality and reproduction. So if you have very quick drop-off over a short amount, so a very quick drop-off in number of individuals within a few ages, that suggests that those ages probably have a lot of mortality. All right, and from this age structure, we can make survivorship curves and compare survivorship curves, and also make predictions about potential population growth or decline. Just as a note, with our age structure, we think of ages as being age 0, age 1, age 2, age 3, and that could be years or months or whatever. But the same could apply if we're dealing with organisms that have, let's say, complex life cycles. Some plants have complex life cycles. You'll have like vegetative growth, you could have reproductive growth. All right, and maybe a perennial plant can switch between those things depending on the environment. Those could be different age classes, or reproductive class is what we could call them. And they reveal similar type of information. Birth schedules, it's how many offspring are born per individual in a time class or in an age class. All right, we use these birth schedules in conjunction with survivorship to calculate R naught. What is R naught? What is this term? R naught. Flip back in your notes, find it. What'd you find? Where is it? What is it? It's our net reproductive rate. What does that tell us? Average number, so it's defined as the average number of offspring produced by an individual in their lifetime. What does that tell us? Yeah, it's going to tell us if the population is growing or declining. So if our population is growing, what's the value of R naught? If our population is growing, it's what? More than 1. So if it's greater than 1, population is growing. You mentioned it. If it's less than 1, what does that mean? Yeah, it's declining. What if it's equal to 1? Yeah, it's not growing or declining. We're in stasis. All right? So we'll calculate R naught. Sex ratios is the third demographic character that we talk about in this part. All right, sex ratio is a proportion of male or female in our population. And our ratio at different age categories can reveal differences in mortality pattern between the sexes. This age or the sex ratio can also reveal potential reproductive rates. So if we're skewed more towards female in a dioecious population, then it suggests that we're going to probably start seeing population growth. If we're skewed towards males, we tend to see, or we can predict that we're probably going to be declining. All right, sex ratios are fairly easy for animals, where you can identify males and females. Plants are another issue, and that's because you have some plants that have both male and female parts on their flowers. Maybe they have separate male-female flowers. Maybe they have separate plants, separate male plants and female plants. Now we could do our individuals, but we also have to deal with flowers. Maybe it's the count of the flowers that matters. So sometimes traditional sex ratios can apply in plants. Other times we have to be a little bit more specific. All right, questions? That's what we finished up. That was a quick summary, since it was on Wednesday of last week. So that quiz will be going live in about 6 minutes. So that's due on Thursday, 11:30. Let's move on. All right. So we've been talking about these characteristics, demographic characteristics, and we've been talking about population growth and decline. That leads us naturally into the dynamics of a population. How does it increase and decrease? What are the patterns? What governs it? Can we estimate population sizes in future generations? And that's what we're going to do. So with our population dynamics, we know that populations change over time. It is extremely rare to find a population that is in complete stasis. It's going to change. Question is why? Well, there's 4 main things that affect our population size: births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. All right, these 4 things are the reason why our populations change. So we have our births. Hopefully that is obvious, right? individuals give birth, they produce new individuals into our population. Same thing with deaths. So births increase, deaths decrease. And then you have migration. So you have immigration, where individuals are coming into our population, and you have emigration, which is individuals leaving our population. So over a specific time period, what we have to do is we know what population we start with. We have to look at how many births do we have, how many deaths do we have, and how many immigrants and emigrants do we have. And then these processes, once we know the numbers, we can then determine if our population is growing or declining. We can represent the change in our population mathematically. And I do so here. So our population size in our next time point. So n sub t is our population size at time t. And we could say that's at today, you can say. Our time point tomorrow, our population size tomorrow would be n sub t plus 1. So one more time, that next time point. So we're going to have births and deaths. So we're going to add our births and we're going to subtract our deaths. And then we're going to account for migration. So we're going to add our immigrants and we're going to subtract our emigrants. And I've grouped these together for a reason. Our births and deaths and I minus E, or migration. I grouped them together because a lot of times we assume migration is 0 or net migration is 0. Just to simplify our predictions, simplify our equations. So we've got our births and deaths, we have our immigration and emigration. So we've got our current population size, we account for births, deaths, immigration, emigration, and that gives us our next population size. And what we can do is get this n sub t out, or off of this right-hand side, and how do we do it? We subtract it, right? So if we subtract n sub t from the right-hand side, we have to do it from the left-hand side, and that gives us this, n sub t plus 1 minus n. That is our change in population size. All right, that is our delta n. That delta n is this b minus d plus I plus e. So I minus e. Let's fix that. How I did that. Missed that. I minus e. That's weird. B minus d plus I minus e. So the pluses we add to our population size. Our minuses we subtract from our population size. All right. So what we're going to talk about is this migration first. We're going to talk about this migration first. So migration is basically dispersal, different from dispersion, right? Dispersion is our spatial pattern. Dispersal is our movement. So dispersal is defined as one directional movement of an individual to or from a population. All right? We specify that one directional movement because we don't want individuals wandering. We don't want to count dispersal as those individuals that just kind of wander around looking for food. They leave and then they come back. That's not really dispersal. But if they leave looking for food and they find it and they stay there in that population, now we have dispersal. All right, so dispersal is one directional movement to or from a population. Dispersal, how much dispersal we have determines our connectivity. We've already had that term. So our connectivity is that link between two populations, and it's the link because of dispersal, because of migration. All right, and just remember, connected populations are demographically and genetically similar. All right, so we know dispersal happens. We know individuals migrate. The question is why? One question could focus, instead of the why of it, is why does it persist? How did it evolve? Well, if it evolved, our benefits had to exceed our costs. So what are the costs of our dispersal? Well, it's going to cost energy. Why does it cost energy? Why does it cost energy? Because we're moving around, right? We're moving around. It's our muscles are working, consumes ATP, right? So it costs energy. It costs energy just to move. It could also cost energy in terms of lost energy. Energy, food that we could have gained, and it could have acquired and converted to energy. If we move, we have that risk. Not only expending energy because of movement, but also the lost energy. We left an area that had some food. Maybe we find a worse area. And the second cost is this increased risk of mortality. Why is there an increased risk of mortality? Why an increased risk of mortality? All right. So one reason, since we're moving to a new place, we don't know what that place is going to be like. Maybe it doesn't have enough water. Maybe it doesn't have enough food. Maybe there's more predators there. All right? That all increases our mortality rate. What's the other reason? That's a good one. I didn't expect to get that. That's a good one. It's the same reason we see increased mortality with migration, long distance dispersal, or seasonal migration. Why did we say that? Why do waterfowl have an increased mortality rate? Hunting, all right. Why? So it's not just humans, right? There's other organisms that hunt them. So just moving around is going to expose yourself to more predators. So that's an increased cost of an increased risk of mortality. So mortality comes from increased exposure to predation and possibility that we end up in an area that's actually worse than where we left. All right. These are pretty big costs. Pretty significant costs. It would stink to go from, let's say, migrate away from a golden corral to a, give me another place that doesn't have a whole lot of food. I'd say like Baskin Robbins, but some of you probably are like, yeah, I'd love to do that. I tell you what, you migrate from a golden corral to like an AutoZone, all right? Has absolutely no food there. You're just gonna die there, Maybe you've got a few candy bars there, that's it. But that's a risk. That's a risk that these organisms had to take when they dispersed. But we know it happens. We know that that organisms can have a desire to move, a desire to disperse. So since they've maintained that desire, there must have been benefits associated to this, and our benefits must have exceeded the cost. So what are they? Well, we set it up here. Actually, your book sets it up like this. Benefit of migrating is the possibility of finding new economic resources, of finding new reproductive resources, and of finding new genetic resources. All right, sets up these three things. The economic resources are all about your nutrition, your food, right? Your habitat, your housing, and all that stuff. This economic resources can lead to range expansion. So when we talk about the biological filtering, you have your potential range. That's all of your abiotic conditions, your abiotic factor, the laws of tolerance. You have these areas where our species should occur, but they don't. Why is that? Well, maybe they didn't get there yet. So when you have a migrant actually find there, here's this untapped resource for them. You're going to see a big population boom. So that's our economic resources. We also have the new reproductive resources. So you can have a situation where it's a hard time finding a mate in your current habitat because let's say there's, sex ratios are skewed towards males or skewed towards female if you're a female. Who knows? but it's skewed in whatever sex you are in your direction, so it's hard for you to get a mate. But if you move to another area, maybe the sex ratio is reversed, and now you find a new mate and you have that potential to leave offspring. All right, so that's our new reproductive resources. And then the third aspect is the genetic resources, and that's all about avoiding inbreeding. Because we talked about the problems of inbreeding, where it exposes these recessive alleles. Well, if we can get to a new area and if we can mate with another population, our offsprings not only have our genes, or at least 50% of our genes, but they have 50% of the new population's genes. All right, so we can avoid inbreeding, increase our genetic variation through this dispersal. All right, so these benefits had to exceed the cost if dispersal has remained a part of our various species. Now, what's going to affect our dispersal? Hopefully, the first thing you can think of is movement. All right, how well does the organism move? All right, and we describe that as vigility. Vigility is the mobility of an organism. An organism that's highly vigile is an organism that can move freely, move a lot. An example of that could be a lot of the birds. They're vigile. They can move. They end up in a habitat, they don't like it, they move on. Woodpecker goes into a tree, starts searching for food, doesn't find it. After 5 minutes, it moves on fairly easily. These are highly vigile organisms. Low vigile organisms are those that don't really have a great ability to move. All right? A lot of plants can't get up and walk away. I know the cartoons might make it seem like they can do that, but they can't. A tree can't get up and relocate to a better area. Right? And we could talk about other organisms that maybe don't have the ability to migrate long distances. They're limited by maybe their biomechanics. All right, so the ability to move, that's one factor that affects our dispersal. The other factor is our propensity to disperse, or our desire to disperse. Species individuals will have this innate sense of moving. Some of them feel like they're going to have to move all the time. Others, perfectly fine staying where they're at. And we could probably, relate it to human populations, where some individuals they like moving. They like going to new places. They have an increased propensity to disperse. Others, they don't like to move. They want to stay where they're at. They want to stay where they're comfortable, and they know the area. All right, so what's going to affect our propensity to disperse? Well, one, there's going to be behavioral adaptations. All right, these are tied to our organism sensing the environment, and then all of a sudden something clicks and says, we need to move. So that could be habitat that used to be good, all of a sudden starts becoming bad. All right, and then all of a sudden something clicks in their mind, and they say, hey, I need to move because the conditions turn bad. Well, let's talk about it. What could be some of the clues that tell an organism the habitat is turning bad? What's the most obvious one? Okay, lack of water. They start having a more difficult time finding a water source. And they're out searching for it, and they search for hours, and then they find a small water hole. And they get it, but then a couple hours later, they need to start finding it again. That's going to signal, hey, maybe I need to move farther. Maybe I need to move out of here and find an area that has an abundant water source. All right, water works. What else? What else? Talked about water. What's the other big one? Food. Food. Lack of food. Yeah, I mentioned the woodpecker. Yeah, there's a study with woodpeckers where they made holes in logs and they hid food in different numbers. Yeah, those woodpeckers, they don't spend a whole lot of time searching through that entire log for food. If they don't find it within the first couple of searches, they move on. They sense there's no food here, even though there might be, and they move on. But if they find food very early in their search, they tend to stay. So yeah, we've got water, we've got food. That tends to signal good versus bad habitat. Crowding is the other aspect. Some organisms cannot tolerate crowding. Why? What does crowding do? I know it spurs movement, but why? What is the effect of crowding on our organism? Okay, so we can sense less resources. Why? What's going on? Yeah, competition. So what we're going to talk about the effect of crowding as a means to regulate populations. But when you start increasing densities, you're increasing competition for those limiting resources, and you could start increasing your aggression. And some individuals sense that aggression probably before they sense a decline in resources. And with that increased aggression, they say, hey, I better start moving. I better start moving. So those are behavioral adaptations. Evolutionary adaptations could be tied to behavior, but with the evolution, for some reason, certain individuals, certain organisms have a desire to move regardless of the conditions, regardless of the environment. Our organism could be in the best habitat possible, yet they still move. And the question is why? Why would they do that? They didn't receive any of these cues here that said conditions are declining. They didn't receive them, yet they still said, I need to move. Why is that? Well, it's thought that there's this evolutionary explanation that promotes movement, and that's tied to outcrossing. So outcrossing is a good thing, right? It promotes genetic diversity. We want that genetic diversity because if our environment changes, we increase the likelihood that at least some of our individuals have the necessary adaptations to survive that new condition. All right? If we have some sort of gene, some gene in our population that says you need to move when you mature, all right, that's going to promote the outcross. Now, you don't need every single individual to move. You only need a small percentage to move. And individuals, researchers that have been interested in this have observed, yeah, there is maybe 5%, maybe 10% of this population will move, will disperse. All right? Not 60 or 70%, but a small number of them, and that's sufficient to promote outcrossing. So evolutionarily, the benefit of having diversity may be one of those reasons why certain individuals have a desire to move. All right, so that's all of our propensity to disperse. Now, plants are a little bit different because they can't get up and move. All right, so for the plants, they have to rely on their seeds. They have to rely on their seed. And they can adjust how well they can disperse based on this design. All right, so this is a good one. Anyone know what kind of seed this is? Who's in botany? I know some of you are. Actually, I could probably predict because when I ask that question, everyone that's in botany puts their head down. Don't call on me. Any guess? Anybody? Nobody? You've all seen it. Yes? No? You've seen it. Do you know it? It's a dandelion seed. Dandelion seed. Really great. Here's the seed, here's our embryo, and then this is all accessory structure to aid in dispersal of the seed itself. Right? These things are small. They float on air. This entire structure is called the diaspora. All right? The diaspora consists of our actual seed and then any accessory structure to aid in dispersal. So some plants, they rely on dispersal, they're going to probably have diaspores that are really good at moving away from that parent plant. Like this one. Relies on the wind. All right, so if we have diaspores that are wind dispersed and they can travel a long distance, and we expect those plants to be able to disperse or be able to move faster than organisms that perhaps don't. So think about our pines, our pine cones, right? They're not really getting picked up and moving by the wind, right? They are relying on falling, bouncing, or perhaps falling and having an animal pick it up and move it. All right, questions on this slide? I think we've got them all. Look at that, dandelion. All right, what's the effect of dispersal? We've had some of this. This is kind of review. All right, so the review part was promoting genetic variation within a species. And we've talked about it, that's connectivity. All right, and that our connectivity is affected by the organismal and our habitat factors. So the organismal factors are all like that ability to disperse and our propensity to disperse, but then we also have the habitat factors. So good quality habitats probably less likely to have a whole lot of dispersals. Emigrants, I should say. Less likely to have a bunch of individuals leave our high quality habitat, but those high quality habitats are going to be more likely to attract more immigrants. And we'll talk about these habitat factors as well as they pertain to meta populations. Then dispersal movement also affects our immigration and emigration numbers, so it's our population size, where they affect. Now, predicting our change in population size is going to be difficult because it's hard to predict when individuals will migrate. And for this, you go to a population and you expect, hey, this is a high quality habitat, it's a big habitat. We shouldn't see a whole lot of movement away from it, yet it does. And then we go to another habitat and we say, yeah, this doesn't look very good for our population. I expect to see a lot of individuals leave and try to find new areas, and it doesn't happen. Why is that? Contingency in ecology. There's something we're missing. There's something that we didn't account for. And for that reason, our predictions end up being wrong. Just kind of know that contingency that comes back. Ready? All right, so that's migration. Births and deaths are going to be the primary factors that affect our population size. All right, what affects our births? A lot of different things. Hopefully this is review from Bio Principles 2 course, I believe, the fall course. All right, so resources will affect our birth rates. More resources, the more births we could have. The more energy we have available to allocate to our offspring. Access to mates. This is important for dioecious species. Right? If we don't have mates, we're not going to mate ourselves. And that means our populations could likely go down. Physical limitations. All right? Might not have considered this, but clutch sizes. Maybe we have an unbelievable number of resources available. The rate at which our population size increases would be limited by how many offspring we can actually have per reproductive event. So you'd predict like a massive increase, but it doesn't happen. We see an increase, but it's not massive. Could be due to our clutch size. And then stress can affect our births. And we'll talk about stress. But stress is tied to crowding. And once you start getting stressful, there's change in hormone levels that start to inhibit your reproductive hormones and thus the desire to mate and reproduce. It's called actually the social stress hypothesis, and we'll talk about that when we talk about regulating populations. That's our births. Our deaths, affected by resources. Right? And it's tied to competition as well. So if we have a high amount of competition, that means there's less resources available to us, which means we could start seeing an increase in mortality rates and thus increase in death rates. The physical factors. Hopefully that's obvious. That goes back to our laws of tolerance, right? If the conditions change and we are now in our zone of intolerance, we're not going to survive. That's going to be an increased death rates. Predation, right? Hopefully, again, pretty obvious. Increase predation rates, you decrease your population size. And then crowding. So we've got crowding affecting stress levels that affect our reproduction. Crowding also affects our crowding. Jeez, oh man. I was looking through that. Crowding influences our stress levels, and they also increase our susceptibility to disease. So crowding's going to have like twofold effects on us. Hits us for reproduction and hits us for increased death rates. All right, quiz. Do our quiz before we get to it, and I'll leave this up so you can get it. Quiz. We're going to probably do Halloween candy this week. So, quiz answer choices are Snickers, Kit Kat, Twix, Butterfinger, and candy corn. I'm not asking you what your favorite is, but our answers today are Kit Kat, Twix, and Butterfinger. Get that done, get the quiz. Kit Kat, Twix, and Butterfinger. All right. So we introduced factors that affect our population size. How do we predict it? So as we move forward with our population growth equations, we will assume that there is no net migration. So that if we have individuals that leave the population, they will be replaced by individuals that enter our population. And that means then that that term in parentheses, the I minus E, that is going to be equal to 0, which leaves only births and only deaths as affecting our population size. All right, so our equations will only have terms that affect our births and deaths. The other distinction between our equations comes down to our discrete versus continuous generations and overlapping versus non-overlapping generations. All right, so the discrete versus continuous is much like variable types when dealing with stats, with statistics. All right, so if we have discrete generations, then we can very clearly identify when the new cohort enters our population. All right, so this is characteristic of like annual plants, or even you can talk about some of our animals that are out there, raccoons and deer and so forth. They have synchronized births. So we can go in and say, yeah, all of these births that happened all at the same time, that's one cohort. That's a discrete generation. And that's different from a continuous generation, where you don't have individuals in our population synchronizing their birth. So like humans, we've got individuals that give birth year-round. Not an individual that gives birth year-round, but we have individuals in our population that will give birth, and some of them are in January, some of them are in February, March, and April, and so forth. All right, so it's very difficult for us to identify one single cohort because they're just reproducing. They can give birth throughout the entire time, all year. All right, so discrete, we have synchronized births. Cohorts are easily identifiable. For continuous growth, we have asynchronous births. Our cohorts are very difficult to identify. Now, the discrete and continuous is only one part of our equations, only one part of our aspect. The other aspect is overlapping versus non-overlapping generations. So if we have non-overlapping generations, then our offspring are going to be reproducing after the parents have died. All right? Now, they can be alive at the same time, but when we reproduce, we don't have any overlap between our parents and offspring, or parents and grandparents, for that matter. All right? Annual plants are a great example. The annual plants, they flower, they set seed, they drop the seed, and then they die. And by the time their next generation comes around, the parents have all been long gone. All right? That's non-overlapping generation. Those annual plants tend to also be discrete generations as well. So discrete, non-overlapping generations for these annual plants. Overlapping generations happen when our adults can reproduce multiple times. So it's possible then that very first time they reproduce, they have offspring, and then by the time those offspring reach reproductive maturity and start reproducing, the parents are still mating and producing offspring at that time. So these are overlapping generations. Humans, overlapping generations. It's hard for us to identify, one generation from a second generation. It's like, where do you set your break between Gen X and Generation Z? No, generation, we missed the Y someplace. Like, all those terms, it's like, where do you fall under? And they arbitrarily put a date, and it's like, what? Really? 1980 sets that mark? Really? What's the difference between individuals born in like the late 70s and early 80s? Who knows? All right. So know these terms: discrete versus continuous, overlapping versus non-overlapping. What I think we're going to do is stop here and start with our population growth equations. So you're going to need a calculator. We're going to do some examples in class. All right. And we'll work through examples on the board. And then there's also some homework that we'll have posted that gives you even more practice in doing these population growth equations. All right. Any questions? Don't forget about the quiz that's due Tuesday night and then Thursday night. And lab this week. Come prepared to calculate some variances and means and coefficient of associations. All right. All right. Happy Monday. We are down to how many more Mondays left? I think we've got 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 Mondays left. Plus 6 is our final exam. 6 Mondays. But who's counting those? All right. Have a good one.